Awesome. All right, so my name's Jason. I am one of the few people here at the event from the video game industry, which I like to think is part of the cultural and creative sectors, but maybe is not always considered because maybe we make too much money. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about ecosystem and pitching. I've been in the game industry for over 25 years. A bunch of that, I was the head of the International Game Developer Association, so actually the organization that represents game developers and game creators from all over the world. It was a great opportunity to work with stakeholders worldwide, from students learning how to become game designers to the professionals, and then the government organizations and schools and private industry all working to support the art of making games. A few years ago, I started something called Execution Labs, which was the first venture-backed game incubator in the world. We were running that out of Montreal in Canada, and we invested in 25 early-stage startups, all working in games and trying to help these studios on their entrepreneurial journey. And then also in Montreal, I set up something called Gameplay Space, which is a non-profit entity, a bit like a makerspace, co-working space, to support artists and designers trying to build new games and new studios. And that's received some government grants, but it really is a kind of a labor of love, a break-even organization. But the studios that were started in that space, over the span of 4 years, we're able to generate over $150 million of revenue and sales and funding and deals from international partners. So although it's nonprofit, it really does have a great amount of economic impact. Speaking of economic impact, games, for those who don't know, are the world's largest entertainment sector. And far, far larger than music and films, just as two industry examples. So you can see the yellow bars, the very big yellow bars of the game industry revenue numbers in the many, many billions of dollars. And then music and film, just as two other entertainment sectors, are there in the blue and green. So games far, far outweigh the other sectors combined. And certainly, generate way more revenue than pretty much any other entertainment sector. In terms of the kind of trend line, this is a bit of a busy graph. It's one you can search for online. It's a really nice one, kind of showing the mix and blend of the different revenues from the early days in the 70s with the arcade machines, all the way up to present day with mobile devices and all the very powerful game consoles and so on. And you see some of the popular games like Pokemon and Angry Birds and Assassin's Creed and stuff like that. But really, a massive, massive sector. What's interesting is games are played by about half the world's population. This shows the makeup of the players worldwide. So about 3 billion players. This data, by the way, is from an analyst firm called Newzoo. So if you're interested in more detailed data on the game sector, I recommend you check out Newzoo. The URL is at the bottom of the slide. And so we can see the Middle East, since we're standing here, represents about 15% of the game players worldwide. But a lot of people play games. And it's really a dominant form of art and entertainment, a dominant form of culture in the world. And then this just shows some of the market forecasts. 2021, we're on the mark to hit about 180 billion. Last year, we were at 175 or 177 billion. Actually, we got a nice bump from COVID. So, unfortunately, while many other sectors were suffering, with everyone locked at home, guess what? People played more games. So the game industry actually did well throughout COVID and is on the mark to surpass 200 billion in the very near future. So very, very healthy industry. There's a lot of investment dollars as well. I mean, I know a lot of creative sectors, the venture community doesn't really pay too much attention, but the game industry, in part because of this, massive growth, there is a tremendous amount of venture dollars. So there are specialized game venture funds currently managing about $2.5 billion of investment. This is from Games One. They track game VCs and show you the sort of the top investors and the deals that they do and so on. So there's billions of dollars flowing into startups and the game industry, just to give you a sense. And just some deals. Right, it's kind of crazy the amount of money. There's this Playco, they're based in, I think, US, Japan, and Brazil. $100 million investment on a $1 billion valuation. This is a startup. Experienced folks. In Turkey, a couple years ago, Zynga, one of the American companies, bought a great studio called Peak for almost $2 billion. In Istanbul. Unity, one of the big technology providers in the game industry, did an IPO last year at a almost $14 billion valuation. So, I mean, every week almost there's these kinds of deals and transactions that are going on. It's quite insane. And I started in the game industry 25 years ago. This kind of activity was not happening. This is sort of a relatively recent occurrence. However, this is not evenly distributed. A lot of that funding, a lot of those dollars are going to, companies that are successful, and the investment is fueling more success. A lot of the work that I do tends to work with the startups and the artists who haven't quite figured out the business side of things. They're in that sort of starving artist mode, and they haven't really figured out how to get paid yet. And so a lot of the programs that we were doing at the nonprofit gameplay space is how do we enable those artists to become entrepreneurs, to more successfully pitch and get funding and build successful companies. And so that's kind of what we'll be talking about today. And so in the game industry, we have this concept of an indie. Right, it's sort of our equivalent term of a think of an indie rock band or an indie filmmaker, independent filmmaker. So we have that same sort of context as well, where we have what we call the indie game developer, indie game designer. And there's some debate about how do we define an indie? Who is that? And how do we enable a greater degree of indie success? And so that's what we're going to talk about. All right, so who's an indie? What's an indie? How do we define indiness? I like to define it across two axes. The vertical axis is the degree of creative freedom you have as a designer, as an artist. And the horizontal axis is to what degree do you have legal independence? Are you your own company? Are you your own legal entity? And so we can take all the kind of game companies, game structures out there and map them across these quadrants. The first one I would place down here, which is kind of a work for hire or service studio, right? They're a company, they're their own legal entity, but they don't have creative freedom. They've been contracted by Disney to make the next Mickey Mouse game, or they're working on animations for the next Angry Birds game. They're a service provider. It's fine business, there's money to be made there, but they don't have creative freedom. They're not working on their own IP, their own ideas, their own creations. So that's where we put these kind of work for hire or service studios. Over here would be the internal studios of the very large game companies like Ubisoft or Electronic Arts or Activision, the big multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations. They all have internal production studios that work on their big franchises like Call of Duty and FIFA and these kinds of games. So they're kind of like in the worst scenario, right? They're not legally independent. They're a division or a subsidiary within this large multinational, and they don't have creative freedom because they're told make the next FIFA or make the next Call of Duty 27 or whatever sequel. I mean, they're well paid. It's a good job to have. But they don't have creative freedom, they don't have legal independence. And then up here is maybe a more rare structure, kind of an internal R&D unit at Activision or Ubisoft, where they're not legally independent because they're the research and development group, but they do have some creative freedom because they've been told to go make something new. Or maybe they've been given a new VR headset or a new device and said, okay, take the next year and experiment with this and make some stuff up. So they've been given some creative freedom, but they're still sort of sitting inside of the large multinational. And then, if it wasn't obvious enough, the indies go up here, the independents, the startups. They're legally independent, they're their own entity, and they have creative freedom. They can work on whatever they want to work on. They're artists, they can decide what they want to build, what they want to create. And so, the work that I do, Execution Labs as an investor, as an incubator, we only ever focused on the indies, on those creators, on those artists who had creative freedom and legal independence. Now, that's a fairly high-level description, and so I'm going to break down indies sort of at another level. So now we're going to take all those designers and creators that have legal independence and creative freedom, and we're going to break them down once again. And this time, the two axes are commercial intent. So to what extent as a creator are you actually trying to make money, or do you care about making money? And then the horizontal is this kind of catch-all term for vision, meaning you're doing innovative work, you're doing something meaningful and interesting and visionary or pioneering. And so we can kind of break down the indies once again. Down here is where we put the kind of the typical starving artist. Right? They're doing something innovative, they're doing something beautiful or interesting, but they're not thinking about money. Not only are they not thinking about money, but in some cases they don't even want you to talk to them about money because they feel like they need to suffer to create something truly meaningful. But this is kind of like the romantic notion of what it means to be an artist in many ways. That happens in the game industry as well. Preserving the purity of your visionary intent. So we definitely have these kind of starving artists in the game industry. Over here is what I would call the sellouts, in that they want to make money, but they're not doing anything particularly innovative or interesting. Maybe they're going to work on an Angry Birds clone, or they're going to try to make a Call of Duty, but in space or something. So they're trying to, they think they have the answer to make money, but in the end they're not really doing anything so interesting. The folks down here are just lost, right? They're not trying to make money. They're not doing anything particularly innovative. I mean, to be fair, maybe this is students, maybe this is hobbyists. They're still kind of figuring their way, trying to find their way in. And then over here is what I call the indie entrepreneurs. So they're doing innovative, meaningful, beautiful, interesting work, artistic work, but they're also doing it in the context of commercial intent. Once again, as an investor, the only quadrant I cared about was the indie entrepreneurs. That I could not invest in the starving artists because they didn't want to touch the money, they didn't want to worry about business or marketing, and the other ones, well, they're just not doing anything so interesting. So all the focus went on indie entrepreneurs, and I think a lot of the sessions here, a lot of the talk around funding and support, I think it's valuable to understand and kind of dissect the intent and the different sort of pockets within the creator communities or artist communities. So we focused our efforts specifically on these indie entrepreneurs, the ones that actually wanted to succeed from a commercial point of view and put food on the table. All right, so when we talk about ecosystems, of course, super complicated. Right? I mean, this whole conference has been a bunch of sessions around ecosystem design and support systems. I mean, it really is this kind of black box of all kinds of different inputs and output systems when we talk about ecosystem. And the game industry is no different. It has similar complexities. And so if we think about that black box, whenever I do work about ecosystem design, policy design, I'm always thinking about the inputs and the outputs. And what I find is oftentimes we focus too much on the black box. Right? We're not properly mapping the inputs and resources we have to work with, and there's almost no discussion about what outputs are we trying to achieve, and really kind of defining success in a much more clear way. And so from the inputs point of view, I mean, we map this all out. Studios, the different schools providing game design, events and conferences and markets, the workers themselves, how many bodies do we have in a given region that know the right skills, the different organizations and nonprofits and NGOs supporting the industry, all the grassroots initiatives and investors, investment community, government agencies, all this kind of stuff. We have to understand that. We have to map that out. I think yesterday there was the really interesting presentation and I forget the name, where they were sort of mapping out the whole ecosystem in the GCC, and they had this amazing website where they tracked all that stuff. So that's super important. From the output point of view, well, jobs, right? What kind of jobs are there? How many startups? What's the tax revenue for the region? The foreign direct investments. So are we attracting other companies to come set up? Intellectual property. To what extent is new IP being created and generated? Immigration. In some cases, people are moving to different countries to participate in these particular in the game sector. Expression, right? Games are an amazing art form. They're an amazing form of cultural expression. So to what extent are we leveraging games, outputting games? And there's also an element of prestige, right? When Finland makes the game Angry Birds and it sells billions of dollars and makes Hollywood movies, that brings a certain amount of prestige and reputation to creators from that region, just as one example of many. And so when I do work around ecosystem design and policy work, that's where I focus my attention, is really on the input mapping and sort of the output definition of success. And so ultimately, your ecosystem must enable indie talent to generate globally successful IP. And that's the formula. How you solve that formula is quite complex, but we often sort of lose sight of that ultimately you want the talent on the ground, the startups, the indie creators, the artists, to be able to generate IP that is successful on a global scale. Now, the game industry, of course, is a global industry, and so that certainly is the formula that works for us. Now, when I talk about ecosystems, there's multiple levels of what I call intervention. You have many industries, many regions, many countries where there is no intervention, there is no government support, there are no grassroots efforts, there's nothing. It's very organic. And the game industry, the nature of it, you can kind of program a game from anywhere, you can succeed from anywhere. You don't need intervention. The intervention is really there just to kind of accelerate and boost things. But so at a base level, we have organic ecosystems. The next level up is self-organizing, where the startups, the entrepreneurs from the region realize they're not alone. And so they decide to meet, share knowledge, exchange, help each other, and it kind of just happens organically. What we see in more regions is what I call assisted intervention, where existing government programs, existing NGOs or grants, they kind of see if they can help out a little bit, or does games kind of fit in what they're already doing. And then in more rare cases, you actually have coordinated ecosystems where government, industry, academia, finance, all these stakeholders are sitting together to coordinate and optimize their interventions and really accelerate the process. And so, really, if you're trying to build a coordinated ecosystem, you're trying to create deliberate systems that enable you to transform your inputs into the desired outputs. And it's kind of as simple as that. But then, what you put in the black box, that's where the real fun starts to happen. And so when I start looking at ecosystems, I'm looking at them across three spectrums to try to understand what the gaps are. We heard a presentation earlier today about sort of filling the gaps, understanding the gaps. And so this is one of the tools I use to do that mapping. So the first spectrum is timing. At what point in time are you intervening? And this, from a project point of view, is either like before the project, sort of work in progress, or after the project. So something like a grant to fund new prototypes, well, that would be pre-timing, right? You propose to receive funding before the project starts, you receive the intervention, and you work on the project. In Canada, we're very famous for having tax incentives, so that's a post intervention, right? I have to make the project, spend the money to make it, and then afterwards I can file for some tax rebates. So that's a post type of spend. And so you would look at all the different interventions, incentives, grant programs, all these kinds of things, and kind of see where do they map out. If you're a large ecosystem like a Canada, you can get away with a lot of post intervention, because there's a lot of companies, there's ongoing business, and now you're kind of optimizing those businesses by providing something like a tax incentive. Whereas if you're trying to grow an ecosystem from the start, you really need to have pre-interventions. You need to fund new prototypes, the creation of new intellectual property. So if I'm in the UAE, for example, and I want to get things really going, I would focus on pre-interventions, not post-interventions. Because if I came here and put a tax incentive, one, I don't think that makes sense because isn't there like no taxes? Anyways, I don't know what the tax regime is like in the UAE, but the point is you want to incentivize the creation of new startups and new IP, so you would do pre-interventions. The next spectrum is on what scale. Right, and here are you sort of intervening at the personal level, the project level, company, or even the sort of sector-wide. And in some cases at the person level, it's training, entrepreneurship, mentorship, coaching, these kinds of things. Obviously project level is stuff like project funding and so on. Or at the sector level, are you doing a sector level promotion? Are you bringing delegations to international markets and this kind of stuff? And then the last spectrum is sort of scope, and here is how narrowly or wide focused are your interventions? Are they programs and interventions that are narrowly focused and optimized for games, or is it more about media or arts? Is it the ICT sector? Is it sort of business in general? I'm a big proponent of having very narrowly focused, optimized programs, but some things can apply at different scopes. So these are just some of the things, or some of the sort of frameworks that I use to kind of map out interventions to kind of see what's going on in a given region. And once you start to do that, you get more clarity of what goes inside the black box. What kinds of things do you need to optimize and improve the ecosystem? So you start to see what the gears look like. Do we need an incubator? Should we put tax incentives, trade missions, online showcases, whatever? Once you've done that mapping, once you've, know what inputs you have to work with, once you know what outputs you're trying to achieve, then figuring out all the different levers and gears you have to put inside the black box, it becomes much clearer. All right, so it's about reducing gaps. What kind of gaps are we talking about? The game industry, it's mainly 5 things. One is talent, right? Just brain power, expertise, distribution, access to the right gatekeepers and tastemakers, right? The discoverability issue, and then funding. And in fact, while most creators will often complain about funding, in many ways funding is the least, or not the least critical, but the easiest gap to solve. The other ones are often much more difficult, but we'll talk about funding because the session was about funding and pitching. But so when we talk about funding, the most important thing to understand is not all funding is the same. And I look at it with a couple of different kind of forks to split it. The first fork is between commercial and non-commercial sources of funding. So in the game industry, even though the game industry is multi-billions of dollars, there still are non-commercial games. There's social impact games, games for change, games that are there to do learning and training and health and wellness that are not necessarily commercial in nature. Just as a couple of examples, and there are many. There's a company out of Boston called Mightier, and they have a special iPad with custom designed games to help kids with ADHD and like temper management. And so they use these games to kind of control their emotions and get better at anger management and stuff like that. And it's like transformative for the families that use it. There's a game made by or funded by the United Nations. It was a football game, but it was a football game that kind of promoted or prevented youth violence of young boys to young girls. And it was this kind of like very subversive, very hidden message that as you played the football game, you kind of learnt things about why it wasn't good to have youth violence and so on. And it was sort of sent to countries all over the world. So this game was not about making money. It was about sort of influencing behavior in positive ways. In Canada, there was a project from the National Film Board called the Museum of Symmetry, which was this very kind of psychedelic, artistic project. It was just pure art. It was done with a VR headset. It was amazingly beautiful. Zero money. They put $500,000 into this, but it was for, artistic purposes. And then there was a really great game a few years ago called Remission. It was a game for kids who had leukemia to better take their medicine. And so they were able to prove that kids who played this game as they were recovering from the leukemia treatment actually had a better survival rate and they had healthier outcomes because the game motivated them to take their medicine on time and et cetera. I mean, there's many, many examples of this kind of stuff. And in fact, if games for change and social impact is of interest, I'm actually involved in a summit that's taking place in Abu Dhabi next year in partnership with Games for Change and 2454 and the US State Department. And we're going to have a whole bunch of game executives from the US coming across to talk about social impact and games for change. So you can ask me about that later on if that's of interest. But anyways, aside from that, so commercial, non-commercial. Non-commercial exists, but I mainly focus on the commercial side. And so there's another fork, right? If we want to embark down the commercial path, it's really the difference between project-based funding and company funding. And this is what creators, they're working on their creations and they just need money. And they go out, almost never understand. Creators, they're working on their creations and they just need money. And they go out into the world and they try to just, harass anyone. Are structured are completely different between project-based funding and company-based funding. And so we're going to look at that a little bit. There's also debt financing, but I'm not a fan of it, so we're not even going to look at it. And debt financing, getting loans from banks, I mean, it tends to only be relevant if you're an existing company with cash flow and so on. So from a startup, indie perspective, from an artist perspective, debt finances is not even really an option. So let's look super quick at project-based financing. What's the logic behind project-based financing? Well, the game, right, the IP, the work of art that you're working on actually has to have some sense of commercial potential. Someone's going to look at that and say, do we believe that game can generate revenue in the marketplace? And so they're going to do some sort of competitive analysis to determine, is it actually promising? Typically, this means the game is a consumable product. That it's a bit like a movie, right? I can buy the game, I play the game, fight the dragons, save the world, and the game is consumed. It's a consumable product. And normally this means it's a paid model, right? I go to the store or I go online and I pay $20, $50 to purchase the game, and then I consume it. So the business model is more paid approach, which represents a kind of a linear success curve. As time goes on, I sell more units of the game, and it sort of represents this kind of linear curve of success. And the deal terms generally are, I take funding now from an investor, from a publisher, in exchange for future revenue. Project-based funding is always an advance against future royalties or an advance against future revenue share. And then you're normally giving up certain intellectual property rights. Who has the right to make the sequel? Who has the right to generate revenue from merchandise or make a movie out of your game, et cetera. And the focus is on go-to-market, right? We're generating or making this game. All the deal terms are based on the outcome of the sales of that game, and so it's about go-to-market. It's a lot of pressure to finish and ship the project. Now, I mean, that's all fairly straightforward. What a lot of creators don't understand is that the timing of the different sources of funding really depends where you are in the production process. So if the sort of the blue kind of pipeline represents a rough production timeline for a game, where you have the early conceptualization phase, then you go into pre-production and prototyping, then you have a much more elongated production phase where you're making the finished game, and then this kind of beta testing phase, and then post-launch. You launch the game, and there's a post phase. We can map all the different sources of funding, along this timeline. And what developers, what artists don't understand is you need to be at that certain phase in time before you can approach those sources of funding, right? So at the very beginning, it's always you. You're always the first investor in your project, or your friends and family love money. You can only really approach external investors like a publisher once you already have a prototype, you're already into production. In crowdfunding, things like Kickstarter, they're actually not really there to help you start the project. They kind of help you finish the project because the audience expects the backers expect that the game is actually much further along in production. So what happens oftentimes is that the artists don't really understand the sweet spot of the timing, and they approach the wrong investor at the wrong time, or the wrong source of funding at the wrong time. And so a big part of what we do is try to educate creators and artists of like, okay, where are you in your production? Which sources of funding should you go after? So, I mean, it's a fairly straightforward or simple approach, but it really makes a big difference. All right, let's look at the company side. So now you say, well, I'd like to get some investors, some VCs into my company. What's the logic here? Here now, it's the company has the perceived potential to grow and scale, to generate value over time, and that the company will exit. What is an exit? Exit is when someone else buys the company, or the company does a public listing on the stock market, which is fairly rare, even for the game industry. It does happen, but it's fairly rare. So it's normally when a bigger game studio buys your studio, for $100 million or whatever, that's an exit. And so, investors are looking for those early metrics that show that your company is headed in that direction, and that shows promise. Now, interestingly enough, the games on this side normally are not consumable products, they're ongoing online services. So something like Fortnite, or even Candy Crush, Angry Birds, these games never end, right? You can play them forever. They're like an online platform that players log into every single day, or every week. And so it's more of an ongoing service. It's less of a, I play it for 10 hours and I've consumed it. So this business model normally is using the free-to-play business model. So you download the game for free, and then when you're playing the game, you can spend $1, as an in-app purchase or a microtransaction to get a bonus or a different costume or a different sword for your hero, this kind of stuff. And often they're endlessly replayable, which means that they represent an exponential success curve. That if one of these games takes off, they go from 0 to $1 billion in a month, or in a very short period of time. So much more explosive growth, which is what attracts the venture capitalists or the VC-style investors. And really, what you're doing now is you're taking funding from those investors in exchange for shares in the company. So you're actually selling equity. You're taking on additional owners. They're becoming partners in your company. Which sometimes artists are quite hesitant to do. And you're also giving up certain shareholder rights, veto rights. So as a shareholder, they get to vote, at meetings and things like that. So, but you don't lose control of your company. So, for any artists that are concerned of taking on an external investor, assuming they don't buy more than half the shares, then you still kind of ultimately have control of your own business. And here now, the focus is on long-term company value. It's much different than the per-project mindset, right? When you take on an investor for your project, everyone's focused on the success of that one project. When you're taking on investors into the company, they're not concerned about any one project, they're concerned about the whole roadmap. They're concerned much longer term of how the company will grow, over time, not just, any one project. So the mindset is quite different and much more long-term focused. All right, and so here now, the timing matters, but in a different way. On the project funding side, the timing was relative to production. Where were you in the production process? Whereas on the company funding side, the timing is relative to your profitability. So let's imagine here the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is profits. The blue line maybe is a typical sort of existence of a company. Whereas at day one, you're losing money, right? You're spending money to produce, to pay wages, to generate, to program your game, and you're kind of losing money for a long time, and then eventually you launch the game, and so you start generating revenue, and ideally you break the break-even line, and now you're generating profits. And so different investors come in at different times. And again, many developers, many artists have no concept of this timing issue. So in the very beginning, it's mostly what we call the 3 Fs, the friends, family, and fools. They're the people who they either love you or they're crazy enough to invest at that very early stage. Then you go on to sort of angel investors or pre-seed funds. Then you have the seed venture capitalists. And these three categories are all before you've proven profitability. So they're going on the potential, they're going on the promise, they're going on their trust in you as a founder, et cetera. And then once you cross the break-even line, or the profitability line, well, now everybody wants to give you millions of dollars, right? They're there to fuel your ongoing success. You have VCs and the growth funds, and then even private equity funds that they're signing $100 million checks and so on. And so one of the biggest issues is that a game designer, an artist, will have heard of all these billions of dollars available in venture, and they'll be on day zero with an idea, and they'll knock on the door of the VCs and say, hey, I'd like my $5 million, please. I have some great ideas. And the VC says, well, where are you on the blue line? You haven't yet, can't write you a check. And so the creators will often get frustrated, and they'll say, well, I hear about all these billions of dollars. How come no one wants to give me $5 million? Well, because they're at the wrong point in the line, right? So they have to go all the way back, and they have to start at the friends, family, and fools, and kind of incrementally move their way up to kind of traverse the blue line. And amazingly, if designers understood this timing and sequencing, there'd be way less frustrations in terms of seeking funding and investment. So that's just sort of one sort of tool. Interestingly enough, obviously check size grows, right? Like as you traverse this timeline, these check sizes get quite massive, but the risk drops. Right, so despite the fact that growth VCs are writing you, $10 million, $100 million checks, it's actually super low risk. Why? Because you've already proven that your business can be profitable, so they're just fueling growth. Whereas, your uncle that gives you $10,000 on day zero, the check size is very small, but in fact is the highest point of risk because it's just a dream, it's just an idea. You don't yet have any evidence that you're going to actually be successful. So it's kind of interesting to sort of see that inversion. All right, so just as a recap, this is sort of the side-by-side of project funding versus company funding. And normally they're incompatible, right? If you're working on, a game as a product with a paid pricing model, then you only ever want to work on the project funding side and don't waste your time with VCs. Whereas if you're working on more the game as an ongoing service using the free-to-play microtransaction type model, then you really want to focus on the venture side of things. And again, artists make the mistake, right? They don't understand. They just need a big bag of money, and so they'll go talk to everybody and anybody and say, please give me money. And only if they sort of understood this kind of fork and also the timing, they would save a lot of hassle and a lot of heartache. All right, now from a pitching point of view, the sad reality is that most artists suck at pitching. They're just absolutely terrible. And certainly in the game industry, almost all game designers are just horrible at it. Part of it, I think, is this kind of sense that you don't want to feel like a dirty salesman, right? I don't know if this is sort of, certainly in North America, the idea of like a car salesman is like the worst kind of sales. They're going to sell you some crappy car and whatever. So there's this sense that as an artist, you don't want to lower yourself to this idea of being a salesperson that I have to shill my products and so on. I think there's some truth to that, but really, I don't think that's actually what's at play. Rather, I think it's more about confidence. That when you're pitching, you really have to know what you're doing. And oftentimes, game designers they're still figuring things out. They're still debating what the design should be, what the art and the look should be. Is the story going to be in this direction or that direction? What are the different gameplay systems? And so I think a lot of artists, a lot of creators don't really have confidence in what they're doing yet when they have to go pitch. And so there's this kind of unease of going to ask for support and money when I haven't really figured out what I'm doing yet. And so I think that's sort of more part of the problem of why designers and artists are so bad at pitching. But also, pitching is about clearly articulating what you're doing so others can understand. And another challenge I see from creators is they're so kind of deep into their artistic process that it's hard for them to articulate, to explain to someone, oh, this is what our thing is about, this is what our story is, these are what the actions are, and so on. It's hard to kind of get outside of themselves to be able to explain what they're doing. And so in that sense, when I coach developers on pitching, I actually coach them about empathy, which sounds, that seems kind of weird, but in fact, it helps when the designer gets outside of themselves and understands who are they pitching to. Am I pitching to my uncle for some love money? Am I pitching to a VC for some growth capital? Am I pitching to a government for a grant? You really have to understand who it is, who are you pitching to? What are their priorities? What are their economics? What looks like an opportunity to them? Without doing that, it just doesn't work. So in fact, pitching is an extremely empathetic process, or should be an empathetic process. And fundamentally, it comes down to this, that the point of pitching is not to prove you're the most awesome game or piece of art or movie or whatever. The point is to show the person you're pitching to that you're the right opportunity for them. And I think a lot of game designers, but I think artists in general, they get so stuck on the first line, right? They're so set on convincing people that they have the best thing, the best game, movie, painting, whatever, that they lose track of this empathy part and this idea of helping the other person you're pitching to understand why they should care about the thing that you're doing relative to their business, to their economics, to what matters for them. So that's kind of the key point, right? Is you have to sort of have that opportunity alignment, and this is something that's so critical. Is you have to understand yourself and what is your opportunity, but then you have to have that empathy to understand, well, what does an opportunity look like to that other party? Again, whether it's your uncle, an investor, a government grant, et cetera. So that's just a super, super quick kind of overview, a little bit about the dynamics of the game industry, a little bit about ecosystem mapping, and kind of dissecting a little bit the funding sources, and for folks that are trying to support their own creator economies or artistic sectors, really understanding those details and kind of looking at it from that empathetic point of view is really, really critical and makes a big difference. So hopefully with all that, that'll give you a little insight, and you'll enable your artists to roll around in some cash and commercial success and struggle a bit less. All right, folks, thank you very much. Once again, my name is Jason, and enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.